My daughter-in-law moved her parents into my home 3 days after my husband died. I said nothing. I simply poured myself another cup of coffee and listened as her mother complained that my kitchen was too outdated. What they did next made them forget one very important thing. I'm glad you're here. Follow my story until the end and tell me where you're watching from. Sometimes the quietest women carry the strongest storms inside them. The house still smelled like Henry. Even after the funeral guests had gone home, even after the casseroles stopped arriving and the sympathy cards stopped filling the mailbox, his scent remained in the walls. Cedarwood aftershave and black coffee. 41 years of marriage reduced to silence and folded suits hanging untouched in the closet upstairs. 3 days earlier, I had stood beside his grave beneath a gray Ohio sky while cold November rain soaked through my coat. I remembered staring at the polished walnut casket, unable to understand how an entire life could disappear beneath 6 feet of dirt. People kept hugging me at the cemetery. You're strong, Eleanor. Henry adored you. Call if you need anything. I nodded politely through all of it because that's what women my age do. We survive things quietly. But nothing prepared me for what waited inside my own home. The morning after the funeral, I woke before sunrise out of habit. Henry had always liked breakfast at exactly 6:30 a.m. 2 eggs, wheat toast, blackberry jam on Sundays. For 41 years my mornings belonged to routine. Now the left side of the bed was cold. I sat there for a long time staring at the dent his body had left in the mattress, listening to the old grandfather clock downstairs tick through the darkness. Every sound inside the house felt louder without him. The pipes, the heater kicking on, the soft creak of settling wood. Grief changes sound. It makes a familiar home feel hollow. I finally wrapped my cardigan tighter around myself and walked downstairs barefoot. The hardwood floor felt cold beneath my feet. I expected silence. Instead I heard laughter. Female laughter. Then cabinet doors opening and closing. For one strange second I thought maybe I was dreaming. Maybe exhaustion had finally pushed my mind too far. But when I stepped into the kitchen, there they were. My daughter-in-law Vanessa stood at the stove wearing one of my aprons. Her blonde hair was tied into a neat ponytail while she flipped pancakes like she owned the place. At my table sat her parents, Harold and Denise Morton. 2 large suitcases rested near the hallway entrance. Denise sipped coffee from Henry's favorite mug. My stomach tightened immediately. "Oh good, you're awake," Vanessa said brightly, not even looking embarrassed. "Mom likes her pancakes with blueberries, so I used the fresh ones from your freezer." Your freezer. Not Eleanor's freezer. Not Mrs. Whitmore's kitchen. Already the language had changed. I stood there gripping the doorway so tightly my fingers hurt. Harold looked up from the newspaper and smiled casually. "Morning, Eleanor." Like this was normal. Like people moved into a widow's home 3 days after a burial every day in America. Vanessa finally turned toward me with that polished smile she used whenever she wanted control without appearing cruel. "They'll be staying with us for a while," she said. Not you." I looked past her toward my son. Daniel entered from the mudroom carrying another suitcase. His eyes met mine for half a second before quickly looking away. That hurt more than anything. Not the suitcases. Not Denise rearranging my kitchen counters. Not even Vanessa acting like mistress of the house. It was my son refusing to look me in the eye. "Daniel," I asked softly. He cleared his throat. "It just makes sense right now, Mom. Vanessa's parents sold their condo faster than expected. And with everything going on," his voice faded weakly. "With everything going on. As though my husband dying somehow created extra guest rooms." I noticed then that Denise had already placed decorative pumpkins across my dining room table. My dining room. The one Henry built with his own hands after working overtime shifts at the steel plant for nearly 7 years. 41 years earlier, that room had been nothing but exposed beams and concrete floors. Henry spent every weekend finishing it himself because I once told him I dreamed of hosting Christmas dinners for grandchildren someday. "This house will always protect you," he used to say. I swallowed hard and slowly walked toward the coffee pot. No one spoke while I poured myself a cup. Vanessa glanced at her mother, probably expecting me to object, to cry, to make a scene. But grief had exhausted me too deeply for loud reactions. Instead, I stirred cream into my coffee and sat quietly at the table. That seemed to confuse them more. Denise broke the silence first. "We may repaint the upstairs guest room," she said casually. "The yellow walls feel a little depressing." My hand froze around the spoon. Those walls were yellow because Henry chose that color after our trip to Charleston in 1998. I looked down into my coffee before anyone could see the pain on my face. Then Vanessa smiled gently and placed a hand over mine. "You need people around you now, Eleanor," she said sweetly. "This house is too big for one person anyway." There it was. Not kindness. Not concern. A beginning. And as I sat there listening to strangers discuss changes to the home my husband built for me, I realized something cold and terrible. They weren't visiting. They were settling in. I barely slept that night. Every sound inside the house felt unfamiliar now. Floorboards creaked beneath footsteps that didn't belong to Henry or me. Doors opened and closed upstairs while muffled voices drifted through the vents. At one point around midnight, I heard Denise laughing loudly at some television show in the living room. Henry and I used to keep quiet after 9 p.m. I lay awake staring at the ceiling fan turning slowly above me. 41 years in this house, and suddenly I felt like a guest. The worst part wasn't even the invasion itself. It was how quickly everything had changed. 3 days earlier, people had stood in this very home whispering condolences while framed photographs of Henry sat beside white lilies in the foyer. Vanessa had cried dramatically against Daniel's shoulder, while guests praised what a devoted daughter-in-law she was. Now she was reorganizing my kitchen drawers. Grief doesn't always arrive as tears. Sometimes it arrives as silence so heavy it presses against your chest until breathing feels like work. The next morning I woke to the smell of bacon. Again. Another sound that didn't belong to me anymore. I pulled on my robe and walked downstairs slowly, holding the railing tighter than usual. My body felt older this week. Heavier somehow. Widowhood aged a woman in strange ways. When I reached the kitchen, Denise was standing on a chair removing my blue china plates from the top cabinet. "Oh, good morning," she chirped. "I hope you don't mind. These shelves make no sense at all." Those dishes had belonged to my mother. Every Christmas dinner for 30 years had been served on those plates. I opened my mouth to respond, but nothing came out. Denise continued talking casually while stacking my dishes on the counter. "I told Vanessa this kitchen just needs better flow. You'd be amazed what modern organization can do." Modern organization. As though my life here had been clutter waiting for improvement. Harold sat at the table eating eggs while reading the newspaper. Daniel stood near the sink scrolling through his phone. No one looked uncomfortable anymore. That frightened me most. People don't settle into cruelty overnight. They settle gradually, one ignored boundary at a time. Vanessa entered wearing expensive workout clothes and carrying one of my coffee mugs. "There's my favorite mother-in-law," she said brightly. I noticed she only used warmth when other people were around or when she wanted something. "How did you sleep?" she asked. "Not much," I answered honestly. She nodded sympathetically, but the expression never reached her eyes. "Well, grief takes time. That's why having family close is important." Family. The word nearly made me laugh. I sat quietly at the table while Denise continued emptying cabinets around me. Then I noticed something else. The framed photograph of Henry and me from our 20th anniversary was gone from the counter near the refrigerator. I looked around slowly. Another photo missing from the hallway table too. A third one from the piano. Tiny absences. Tiny erasures. "Where are my pictures?" I asked quietly. Vanessa glanced toward the hallway. "Oh, Mom thought the house looked a little crowded, so we're simplifying some things." Simplifying. Like 41 years of marriage were seasonal decorations to be boxed away. My throat tightened so suddenly I had to look down at my hands. Henry hated clutter too. But he loved photographs. He used to stop in the hallway almost every evening just to smile at old family pictures. "This," he'd say softly, "is what a good life looks like." I wondered what he would say if he saw strangers removing our memories before the flowers from his funeral had even died. Later that afternoon, I walked into the den and found Harold asleep in Henry's recliner. Not sitting. Sleeping. His shoes propped on the footrest. The television playing loudly. I stood frozen in the doorway. Henry's recliner had been sacred to me for years. brown leather worn soft from decades of evenings spent reading newspapers, watching baseball games, or dozing off beside me after dinner. After his heart attack, I hadn't even been able to sit there myself. But Harold occupied it comfortably like he belonged there. I quietly backed out of the room before he woke up. That was the moment I realized something painful. They weren't waiting for me to recover. They were waiting for me to disappear. That evening, Vanessa ordered takeout without asking what I wanted. Thai food. Henry couldn't tolerate spicy food, so we rarely ate it. The smell alone made the kitchen feel foreign. As we sat around the dining table, Denise casually mentioned nearby retirement communities. "There's a beautiful senior village about 20 minutes from here," she said while sipping wine. "They have yoga classes and little gardening clubs. Women our age deserve easier lives." Our age. She was only 62 and dressed like she planned to live forever. I looked at Daniel. Surely now he would say something. Surely now my son would realize how inappropriate this conversation was while his father's shoes still sat by the front door. But Daniel only stared down at his plate. Vanessa reached over and touched his arm gently. "This house is just too much responsibility for one person," she said softly. "Especially after everything Eleanor's been through." Eleanor. Not Mom. Not even Mrs. Whitmore anymore. Just Eleanor. Detached. Reduced. Managed. I folded my napkin carefully onto the table and stood up without finishing dinner. "Are you all right?" Daniel finally asked. I looked at my son for a long moment. The little boy who used to run into my arms after nightmares. The teenager Henry coached through heartbreak and baseball losses. The grown man who once promised he'd always protect family. "I'm tired," I said quietly. Then I walked upstairs alone. But halfway down the hallway I stopped. The door to Henry's office was open. And inside, Vanessa's father was measuring the walls with a tape measure. I stood there silently watching Harold stretch the tape measure across Henry's office wall, like he was preparing to renovate a property he'd already purchased. The office had always been Henry's sanctuary. Dark oak shelves lined the walls from floor to ceiling, filled with history books, old fishing magazines, and faded photo albums. From road trips we'd taken over 4 decades together. His desk still held the reading glasses he'd worn the morning before his heart attack. A half-finished crossword puzzle sat beside them. And now a stranger was discussing dimensions inside that room. 13 feet, Harold muttered to himself while jotting notes onto a yellow legal pad. Plenty of space. Space for what? I felt suddenly cold despite the heat running through the house. Harold finally noticed me standing in the doorway. He lowered the tape measure casually, almost annoyed at being interrupted. "Oh," he said. "Didn't hear you there. What are you measuring?" I asked quietly. He shrugged. "Denise thought this room could make a nice sitting area for us. Maybe add a sleeper sofa. For us." I stared at him for several seconds, certain I had misunderstood. But no, he genuinely meant it. They were redesigning my husband's office before the cemetery flowers had even wilted. Something sharp twisted deep inside my chest then. Not loud anger. Something colder. The kind of pain that arrives when reality finally stops pretending to be temporary. "I see," I said softly. Harold nodded, apparently relieved I wasn't causing trouble. "That old desk probably needs to go," he added casually. Opens the room up. That old desk. Henry bought that desk with his first Christmas bonus after becoming shift supervisor at the steel plant in 1987. I remembered helping him carry it into the house because we couldn't afford movers back then. 4 years, that desk held our bills, Daniel's report cards, handwritten birthday cards, and eventually Henry's retirement paperwork. A marriage leaves fingerprints on objects. People who truly love a home understand that. But invaders only see furniture. I turned away before Harold could see my face. Downstairs, I found Vanessa sitting on the couch scrolling through her phone, while some home renovation show played softly on television. She looked up and smiled pleasantly. "We're thinking about making the upstairs brighter," she said immediately. "This house has great bones, but it feels a little dated." Dated. The same word people use for old department stores and worn-out shopping malls. Not for a life someone carefully built over 41 years. I remained standing. "When exactly are your parents leaving?" I asked. The room went quiet. Vanessa slowly lowered her phone into her lap. Her expression stayed polite, but something colder moved underneath it now. Something calculating. Well, she said carefully, that depends on what's best for everyone. Everyone. I noticed she still spoke as though she represented the household now. Daniel entered carrying grocery bags before I could answer. The tension in the room hit him immediately. What's going on? He asked nervously. I looked directly at my son. When are they leaving? Daniel sighed heavily like I was the difficult one. Mom, can we not do this tonight? Not do this. As though I were creating discomfort by questioning why strangers had moved into my house. Vanessa stood and crossed her arms gently over her chest. You shouldn't be alone right now, she said softly. Honestly, this arrangement makes the most sense. There it was again. Not grief support. An arrangement. Transition. A slow replacement happening in front of me while everyone pretended it was kindness. I studied my son carefully then. His slumped shoulders. Avoiding eye contact. The exhaustion on his face. And suddenly I understood something important. Daniel wasn't leading this situation. He was surrendering to it. That realization hurt almost worse than Vanessa herself. Because controlling people rarely arrive loudly. They settle into weak spaces and slowly take root. That night, I sat alone in my bedroom holding one of Henry's old flannel shirts against my chest. Outside the window, cold rain tapped softly against the glass. I remembered another rainy night 32 years earlier when Daniel was 8 years old and terrified of thunderstorms. Henry had carried him into our bed wrapped in a blanket while lightning flashed across the room. You always protect your family, Henry whispered to our son that night. Daniel nodded sleepily against his father's chest. At the time I believed lessons like that lasted forever. Now I wasn't so sure. Around midnight I went downstairs for water. As I reached the staircase landing, I heard voices from the kitchen. Vanessa's voice. Sharp. Whispering. She's more emotional than I expected, she said. Denise answered quietly. That's normal. Women her age cling to houses because it's all they have left. I stopped moving. Every muscle in my body went still. Then Vanessa laughed softly. Well, once we get her somewhere smaller, this place will finally feel like ours. Ours. Not Daniel's. Not family's. Ours. The kitchen fell silent for a moment before Harold spoke. You sure the paperwork won't be complicated? No, Vanessa replied confidently. Daniel said the house was mostly in his father's name anyway. Once Eleanor decides she can't handle living alone, everything gets easier. My hand tightened around the staircase railing so hard it hurt. They weren't helping me through grief. They were waiting for grief to weaken me enough to surrender. And for the first time since Henry died, my sadness began slowly transforming into something else. Awareness. Because suddenly every strange comment, every moved photograph, every conversation about retirement communities, every suitcase, it all fit together. This wasn't spontaneous. This had been planned. The next morning I woke before dawn again. For 41 years, Henry had been the first person awake in the house. He used to shuffle downstairs in those faded gray slippers, humming old Frank Sinatra songs while the coffee brewed. Even during difficult years, layoffs, surgeries, money problems, mornings between us had always felt steady, safe. Now the silence inside my bedroom felt unbearable. I reached across the mattress out of habit. Cold sheets. Empty space. Widowhood is cruel that way. Your body keeps searching for someone your mind already knows is gone. I sat up slowly and looked around the room Henry and I had shared since 1989. Pale cream walls. Dark cherry furniture. Family photographs lining the dresser. Or at least what remained of them. 2 frames were missing. I noticed immediately. One photo had been from our 30th anniversary trip to Maine. The other was Daniel at 16 standing beside Henry, after winning a regional baseball championship. I stared at the empty spaces on the dresser for a long time. Tiny disappearances. That was Vanessa's method. Nothing dramatic. Nothing loud enough to confront directly. Just small erasures happening one piece at a time. Downstairs I could already hear movement in the kitchen again. Cabinet doors opening. Denise talking loudly. A television running somewhere. My home no longer woke gently. I dressed quietly and walked downstairs wearing one of Henry's old wool cardigans. The sleeves hung slightly loose on my arms now. I'd lost nearly 9 pounds since his heart attack. The kitchen stopped for half a second when I entered. Not because they respected me. Because intruders always pause when the homeowner appears unexpectedly. Then Vanessa smiled brightly. There she is. She stood near the counter arranging fresh flowers into a vase I normally use for Thanksgiving centerpieces. My Thanksgiving centerpiece, Denise, sat at the table flipping through one of my Southern Living magazines while Harold drank coffee from another one of Henry's mugs. Daniel was already dressed for work. That surprised me. My son rarely wore ties unless Vanessa asked him to. You're heading into the office? I asked. He nodded quickly. Just for a few hours. Vanessa answered before he could continue. We talked last night, and honestly I think getting back into routine will help everybody. Everybody. Again. I poured myself coffee quietly. The pot was nearly empty. For decades Henry always made sure I got the first cup. Funny how love reveals itself most clearly through tiny habits after someone dies. I stood near the sink staring out the window toward the backyard garden Henry planted 15 years earlier. Winter had started killing the roses already. Brown edges curled inward beneath the frost. Henry used to cover those bushes himself every November. Good roots survive cold seasons, he'd always say. At the time I thought he was talking about gardening. Now I wondered if he meant us. You know, Denise suddenly said behind me. This property probably has excellent resale value now. I slowly turned around. She continued casually buttering toast. Houses this size are hard to maintain for older women alone though. Older women. As though I weren't standing 3 feet away. Vanessa nodded sympathetically. That's what I keep trying to explain to Eleanor. Explain. Not discuss. Not ask. Explain. Like decisions about my future were already moving forward, and I simply needed help understanding them. Daniel avoided my eyes entirely. That hurt more every day. I remembered another kitchen. Another morning. Daniel at 10 years old sitting at this same table crying because neighborhood boys made fun of his second-hand sneakers. Henry had crouched beside him and said firmly, "A real man protects people weaker than him. Especially family." Daniel worshipped his father back then. Now he couldn't even defend his widowed mother from dinner-table conversations about selling her house. Grief changes children too, I suppose. Some become softer. Others become strangers. Later that afternoon, I finally forced myself into Henry's office alone. The room still smelled like leather-bound books and cedar aftershave. Dust floated through thin bars of winter sunlight crossing the shelves. For one beautiful second it still felt untouched. Then I noticed small things. A missing drawer key. One bookshelf partially emptied. A stack of folders moved from the desk. Someone had been inside here. Carefully. Searching. My stomach tightened immediately. I crossed the room slowly and opened the lower desk drawer where Henry kept personal documents. Insurance papers. Tax records. Bank information. The folder inside looked thinner than I remembered. Much thinner. I sat down heavily in Henry's chair. The leather creaked beneath me exactly the way it used to beneath him. Suddenly I could picture him there perfectly. Glasses low on his nose, reading financial statements while old jazz records played softly nearby. Henry handled nearly everything involving money. Not because he didn't trust me. Because he liked taking care of me. You spent your life taking care of everybody else, he used to say. Let me carry the boring stuff. A tear finally slipped down my cheek then. Not loud crying. Just one exhausted tear. Because for the first time since the funeral, fear had entered my grief. Not fear of loneliness. Fear of what these people might already be planning. I opened another drawer carefully. Inside sat Henry's old black notebook. The one he carried for years. My fingers trembled slightly as I opened it. Most pages contained ordinary notes. Account numbers. Contractor estimates. Grocery reminders. Then near the back I found something strange. One sentence underlined twice in blue ink. Make sure Eleanor is protected no matter what happens. I stared at those words for a long time. And suddenly deep beneath all the sadness and exhaustion, I felt the first small flicker of something I hadn't felt since Henry died. Not hope. Instinct. Because my husband had known something. And whatever it was, Vanessa clearly didn't know it yet. Top of form, I waited until everyone left the house before opening the notebook again. Vanessa had taken her parents shopping. Daniel was at work. For the first time in days, silence finally returned to my home. Real silence. Not television noise. Not forced laughter. Not strangers opening my cabinets. Just the old grandfather clock ticking steadily in the hallway. I carried Henry's notebook into the sunroom and sat beside the window overlooking the backyard. Winter clouds hung low over the trees, turning the afternoon sky pale gray. The garden looked tired now. Dead rose petals scattered across the frozen grass. Henry hated unfinished things. Every autumn, before the first frost, he prepared the garden carefully because he believed survival depended on preparation. Maybe people were the same way. I turned another page slowly. Most of the notebook contained harmless reminders. Phone numbers. Property tax dates. Appliance warranties. Then I noticed several pages folded together near the back. My heartbeat slowed. Henry only folded pages when something mattered. Inside, I found handwritten notes about the house, deed information, trust details, bank contacts, and beneath that, another sentence written carefully in his uneven handwriting. If anything feels wrong, tell Margaret everything. Margaret. I hadn't heard that name in weeks. Margaret Ellis had been Henry's attorney for nearly 20 years. Sharp-minded, calm, the kind of woman who noticed things other people missed. She'd handled our wills after Henry's first heart procedure back in 2014. I stared at the note for a long moment. Then I heard the front door downstairs open suddenly. Voices. I quickly closed the notebook. Vanessa's heels clicked across the hardwood floor while Denise laughed loudly about something from the shopping mall. Bags rustled downstairs. I slipped the notebook beneath a folded blanket just as footsteps approached the sunroom. Vanessa appeared first. "Oh," she said pleasantly. "There you are." I looked up calmly. Her eyes moved briefly around the room before landing on me again. Always observing. Always calculating. "We picked up new curtains for the guest room," she announced cheerfully. "Mom found some beautiful cream-colored ones that really brighten the space." The guest room. The room Henry painted himself during the summer of 2006 while old country music played through the entire house. I nodded faintly without responding. Vanessa stepped closer. "You've been spending a lot of time alone up here," she said gently. "I like quiet." Her smile tightened slightly. "Well, isolation isn't healthy after a loss." There it was again. Not concern. Positioning. Like she was building a future argument piece by piece. I suddenly realized something chilling. Vanessa documented everything. Every moment I looked tired. Every quiet hour. Every forgotten meal. She wasn't just taking over my home. She was preparing a story about me. An aging widow struggling alone. A grieving woman unable to manage her life. The kind of story people easily believe. That night during dinner, the performance continued. Harold discussed real estate prices. Denise talked about senior-friendly communities. Vanessa kept touching Daniel's arm softly whenever he looked uncomfortable, steering every conversation gently back toward what's best for Eleanor. By the end of the meal, I felt less like a person and more like a problem everyone was solving. Then Denise made a mistake. A small one, but enough. "You know," she said casually while sipping wine. "The assisted living place Vanessa showed us online actually looked lovely." The room froze. Vanessa's fork stopped halfway to her mouth. Daniel looked up immediately. But I stayed perfectly still. "Showed us." Not showed me. Not researched. Showed us. Meaning these conversations had already happened before Henry died. Quietly. Privately. Without me. Vanessa recovered first. "Oh, Denise misspeaks sometimes," she laughed quickly. "We were just talking generally." Generally. I looked directly at her for the first time all evening, and suddenly she looked away first. Interesting. Because manipulative people only stay confident while they control the rhythm of the room. The moment silence shifts unexpectedly, they panic. I folded my napkin neatly beside my plate. "When exactly did you begin discussing assisted living?" I asked calmly. Nobody answered. Daniel stared at the table. Harold cleared his throat awkwardly. Vanessa forced another smile. "We're only thinking ahead because we care about you." Care. Such a dangerous word when spoken by selfish people. I stood slowly. At 68, standing from a dining chair now took me longer than it used to. Grief had weakened my body these past weeks. My knees ached more. My hands trembled occasionally from exhaustion. Vanessa noticed every one of those things. She thought weakness meant surrender. But old women survive differently than young ones understand. We survive quietly, patiently. We watch before we move. I'm tired, I said softly. Then I walked upstairs without another word. But this time I didn't cry behind my bedroom door. Instead I locked it, sat at Henry's desk, and called Margaret Ellis the next morning at exactly 8:15 a.m. The moment she heard my voice, she went silent for 2 full seconds. Then she asked one question. Eleanor, has Vanessa started making changes to the house already? Margaret Ellis did not sound surprised. That unsettled me more than panic would have. I sat alone in Henry's office clutching the phone while pale winter light spilled across the carpet. Downstairs, I could hear Denise unloading groceries and Vanessa directing where things should go in my kitchen. My kitchen. Yet somehow I already felt like I needed permission to breathe inside it. Margaret lowered her voice carefully. Eleanor, she said, I need you to answer me honestly. Has anyone mentioned selling the property? I looked toward the office door instinctively before replying. Yes. A long silence followed. Not confusion. Confirmation. My stomach tightened. Then Margaret sighed softly. Henry was worried this might happen. For several seconds I couldn't speak. Outside the window, cold wind bent the dead rose bushes near the fence line. Henry planted those bushes the summer Daniel graduated high school. I remembered him kneeling in the dirt for hours with sweat soaking through his t-shirt while Vanessa, still just Daniel's college girlfriend back then, sat on the patio scrolling through her phone, barely speaking to anyone. Even then, Henry noticed things I ignored. What do you mean he was worried? I whispered finally. Margaret hesitated carefully, choosing her words the way attorneys do when truth carries weight. About 2 years ago, Henry updated several legal documents. He specifically asked me to protect your rights to the home. Protect. The word settled heavily in my chest. Because suddenly Henry's strange comments over the past year started returning to me. The questions about whether I knew where paperwork was kept. The reminders to never sign documents without reading them slowly. The way he once asked unexpectedly during dinner. If something happened to me, would you stay in this house? At the time I thought he was simply aging. Preparing for mortality. Now I wondered if he'd already seen danger approaching. Margaret, I asked carefully, did Henry think Daniel would push me out? No, she answered immediately. But then she paused. I think Henry worried Daniel could be influenced. Influenced. Such a polite word for manipulation. Downstairs, I suddenly heard Vanessa laughing loudly again. The sound traveled through the vents like nails against glass. Margaret continued speaking softly. Eleanor, listen to me carefully. Do not sign anything, no matter how harmless it appears. A chill moved through me. What kind of things? Power of attorney documents, property transfer forms, assisted living paperwork, medical authorization papers, anything. My grip tightened around the phone, because only someone familiar with these situations would list those documents so quickly. How often does this happen? I asked quietly. Margaret was silent for a moment. More than you'd like to believe. That sentence stayed with me. More than you'd like to believe. Not strangers. Families. Children. Spouses. People circling. Grief like vultures circling open land. I closed my eyes briefly. I don't understand, I whispered. Daniel would never hurt me. And for the first time, Margaret's voice softened completely. No, Eleanor. But weak people don't always stop harmful ones either. That hurt because it felt true. After the call ended, I sat motionless in Henry's chair for nearly 10 minutes. Everything inside me felt rearranged now. Before today, I believed I was dealing with insensitivity, control, maybe greed. But this was different. This had structure, preparation, planning. I suddenly understood why Vanessa remained so calm all the time. Because she thought the outcome was already guaranteed. An aging widow. A grieving son. A large valuable house. People make assumptions about older women when they lose husbands. They think loneliness creates dependency. That exhaustion creates confusion. That grief weakens judgment. And sometimes it does. But grief can also sharpen instinct. Especially in women who spent decades protecting homes, raising children, surviving disappointments quietly. I heard footsteps approaching upstairs. Quickly, I placed Henry's notebook back inside the drawer. A soft knock followed. Then Vanessa opened the office door halfway. "There you are," she said warmly. I was getting worried. Worried. Always the performance.
Infine, he answered calmly.
Her eyes scanned the room immediately. The desk. The drawers. My hands. Searching. "You shouldn't isolate yourself," she said gently. "That's not healthy." Again with healthy. Everything suddenly sounded rehearsed now. Like she'd been building a narrative around me for months. I stood slowly from the chair. I was just thinking about Henry. To my surprise, something flickered across Vanessa's face then. Annoyance. Very brief. Gone almost instantly. But I saw it. Because mentioning my husband reminded her this house still belonged emotionally to someone she couldn't erase completely yet. "Well," she said brightly, "Mom and I are going shopping tomorrow for some things the house needs." Needs. Not wants. Needs. What things? "Oh, little updates." She smiled casually. "Fresh towels. New storage containers. Maybe lighter paint samples for downstairs." Paint. She was already redesigning my home in her mind. I walked past her quietly into the hallway. Then stopped. "Vanessa," I said softly. She turned. This house was Henry's life. For the first time since the funeral, her smile disappeared completely. Only for a second. But long enough. Then she recovered smoothly. "And now we're trying to take care of you inside." No, not take care. Take over. That night, after everyone went to bed, I walked downstairs alone. The house sat in darkness except for faint moonlight across the living room floor. I stood beside Henry's recliner for a long time. Then I noticed something strange near the trash can beside the desk. A crumpled piece of paper. I picked it up slowly and unfolded it beneath the lamplight. At the top was the logo of a local real estate company. And beneath it, written in Vanessa's handwriting, "Estimated listing price after renovations." I stared at the paper in my hands until the words blurred together. Estimated listing price after renovations. Not if the house sold. After renovations. As though the decision had already been made. The paper trembled slightly between my fingers. I wasn't sure whether it was anger, exhaustion, or simply the weight of finally seeing proof of what my instincts had been warning me about for days. Vanessa wasn't imagining a future here. She was planning one. And in her version of that future, I no longer existed inside this house. I slowly folded the paper and slipped it into the pocket of my cardigan, just as footsteps creaked upstairs. Someone was awake. The house had become dangerous in quiet ways now. Every conversation lowered when I entered rooms. Every smile felt rehearsed. Every act of kindness carried strategy underneath it. I turned off the lamp and walked carefully back upstairs. In my bedroom, I locked the door again before sitting on the edge of the bed. Henry's side remained untouched. His reading lamp. His watch. The novel he never finished. For weeks after his death, I'd been too consumed by grief to notice anything beyond survival. But now something else had entered my sorrow. Clarity. And clarity can be frightening. Because once you truly see people, you cannot unsee them again. The next morning, snow fell for the first time that winter. Thin white flakes drifted across the backyard while the house buzzed with activity downstairs. Denise hummed Christmas songs in the kitchen, even though Thanksgiving hadn't arrived yet. Too cheerful. Far too cheerful for a house still carrying funeral flowers. I dressed slowly and walked downstairs. Vanessa sat at the dining table beside several folders and paint samples spread across the wood surface. My dining table. The one Henry built by hand. She looked up brightly when she saw me. "Perfect timing," she said. My stomach tightened immediately. Manipulative people always sound cheerful before asking for something. "What is this?" I asked calmly. "Oh, nothing major," Vanessa replied lightly. "We're just trying to organize things so life becomes easier for everybody." Everybody. Always everybody. Never me. Daniel appeared beside her holding a coffee mug. He looked exhausted. Dark circles shadowed beneath his eyes now. Good. At least someone still felt uncomfortable. Vanessa slid a folder toward me. We've been researching a few retirement communities nearby, she explained gently. Just informational. I didn't touch the folder. The room felt strangely warm despite the snow outside. Denise entered carrying toast and immediately joined the performance. You'd love the one near Brookside, she said enthusiastically. They have yoga classes and little art workshops. Art workshops. As though old women could be distracted into surrendering their homes with watercolor classes and soup socials. I looked directly at Daniel. Did you know about this? His jaw tightened. Mom, not yes. Not no. Just Mom. The coward's answer. Vanessa leaned forward sympathetically. No one is forcing anything, she said smoothly. We're only discussing options because this house is becoming overwhelming for you. Overwhelming. Interesting word. I thought about the years I managed this house while raising a child, balancing bills, caring for Henry after surgeries, surviving layoffs, funerals, and decades of ordinary hardships. But suddenly I was too fragile to handle dish towels and utility bills? No. This wasn't concern. It was positioning. Creating a story where removing me sounded reasonable. I opened the folder slowly. Photographs of smiling elderly couples stared back at me beside phrases like, stress-free living, compassionate care, simplify your future. One brochure had handwritten notes in Vanessa's neat cursive. 2-bedroom unit available. My chest tightened. Not a possibility. Preparation. Then I saw something else clipped inside the folder. A legal checklist. Property transition planning. My fingers froze against the paper. Vanessa noticed immediately. That's just standard paperwork, she said quickly. Too quickly. I looked up slowly. And for the first time since Henry died, I let the silence stretch long enough to make everyone uncomfortable. Denise shifted awkwardly. Harold suddenly became very interested in his coffee. Daniel rubbed his forehead nervously. Only Vanessa held my gaze. Confident. Certain. She truly believed I was weak now. That grief had hollowed me out enough to surrender quietly. Finally, I closed the folder carefully. Then I smiled. Not warmly. Just enough. You've all put a great deal of thought into my future, I said softly. Relief immediately flickered across Vanessa's face. She thought I was cooperating. That was her mistake. Because manipulative people become careless the moment they think they've won. I only want what's best for you, she said sweetly. I nodded slowly, then reached into my cardigan pocket and placed the crumpled real estate paper directly onto the table between us. Silence. Complete silence. Vanessa's face lost color instantly. Daniel frowned and picked up the paper. Harold stopped breathing for about 3 seconds. I watched every expression carefully. Years of motherhood teach women how to read rooms long before words arrive. What's this? Daniel asked quietly. Nobody answered. I folded my hands calmly in my lap, then looked directly at my daughter-in-law. I was hoping, I said softly, you could explain why my house already has a projected sale price. The entire room went still. Not ordinary silence. The kind of silence that changes relationships forever. Snow drifted softly outside the dining room windows while Daniel stared down at the crumpled paper in his hands. I watched confusion slowly spread across his face as he read the logo from the real estate company. Then he looked at Vanessa. What is this? Her recovery came fast. Too fast. Manipulative people survive through speed. Deflect quickly. Smile quickly. Explain quickly. Oh my God! She laughed nervously, brushing hair behind her ear. That's not what it looks like. Interesting answer. Not, I've never seen that. Not. There's been a misunderstanding. Just, that's not what it looks like. Because guilty people rarely deny first. They minimize. Daniel kept staring at the paper. Estimated listing price after renovations? He read slowly. Vanessa leaned forward immediately. We were only exploring possibilities, she explained smoothly. Your mother keeps saying how lonely the house feels now. And I thought maybe downsizing could eventually help her emotionally. Emotionally. Everything always returned to my emotions. My grief. My age. My supposed fragility. Never once had anyone asked what I actually wanted. I sat quietly watching her construct the story in real time. The caring daughter-in-law, the concerned wife, the practical planner. Honestly, if I didn't know better, I might have believed her too. But then Harold made a mistake. Small. Tiny. Enough. Well, the market's strong right now, he muttered absent-mindedly before realizing everyone had heard him. Vanessa's head snapped toward her father instantly. Too late. Daniel looked up slowly. The market, he repeated. Denise jumped in quickly. He just means generally. But momentum had shifted now. And once cracks appear inside carefully managed stories, truth starts leaking through faster than people can control. I folded my hands calmly on the table. Why were there renovation estimates? I asked softly. Vanessa smiled again, though tighter this time. Eleanor, sweetheart. Homes always need updates before selling. Selling. There it was. Finally spoken aloud. The word seemed to echo through the room. Daniel looked genuinely startled now. Wait, he said slowly. You were seriously looking into selling the house? Vanessa blinked at him. Not emotionally. Strategically. Like she was recalculating. I thought we discussed this, she replied carefully. No, Daniel answered immediately. You mentioned helping Mom eventually. Not this. Interesting. Very interesting. Because suddenly I could see the fault line inside their marriage. Vanessa had been guiding conversations privately, carefully, one suggestion at a time. Never enough to alarm Daniel completely. Just enough to slowly normalize the idea. That's how controlling people work. Not through force. Through repetition. Through emotional exhaustion. Through making resistance feel unreasonable. I stood slowly from the table. At 68, standing up now required effort after long periods sitting. My joints ached constantly these days. Vanessa noticed immediately. Her eyes tracked weakness automatically. Like a predator evaluating injured movement. You should sit, she said gently. I ignored her. Then walked toward the kitchen counter where Henry's old coffee mug still sat drying beside the sink. For a moment my fingers rested lightly against the ceramic handle. I remember buying that mug during a road trip through Vermont in 1997. Henry dropped it once while washing dishes and spent 2 days repairing the tiny crack because he said some things deserved saving. Funny. People rarely repair relationships with the same care they give coffee mugs. Behind me, Daniel finally spoke again. Vanessa, did you already contact a realtor? The hesitation lasted barely 2 seconds. But 2 seconds is forever when truth enters a room. Only informationally, she answered. Informationally. I almost smiled. That wasn't even a real answer anymore. Just corporate language wrapped around manipulation. Daniel pushed his chair back hard enough that the legs scraped sharply against the hardwood floor. You talked to a realtor before discussing this with me. Now Vanessa's calm began slipping. I was trying to prepare for the future. The future. Daniel snapped. Dad's been dead for 1 week. Exactly 1 week. And still his shoes remained by the front door. Still his coat hung in the hallway closet. Still I woke up some mornings forgetting he was gone for half a second before reality crushed me all over again. But Vanessa had already moved on to paint samples and listing prices. Because grief interrupts ambition only in people capable of love. Denise stood suddenly. Everyone needs to calm down. No, Daniel said sharply. I want answers. For the first time since Henry's funeral, my son actually sounded awake. Vanessa saw it too. And she adapted instantly. Tears filled her eyes with almost impressive speed. I cannot believe I'm being attacked for trying to help your mother, she whispered. There it was. The pivot. From planner victim. Classic. I watched Daniel's anger weaken immediately. Of course it did. Vanessa knew exactly which emotional strings controlled him. She reached for his hand. I've been worried sick about Eleanor living alone, she continued softly. You know how forgetful she's been lately. Forgetful. My stomach tightened immediately. That word mattered. Not emotional. Not grieving. Forgetful. Because forgetfulness creates legal narratives. I finally turned around slowly. What exactly have I forgotten? I asked calmly. Vanessa blinked. You left the stove on last Tuesday. I was boiling tea water. You misplaced your reading glasses twice. They were in my sweater pocket. Daniel looked between us uncertainly. Good. Let him feel uncertain. Because certainty was how Vanessa controlled this house. I walked back toward the table slowly, then pulled out the chair beside my son. Daniel, I said quietly, did your father ever tell you what this house meant to him? His expression changed immediately. Pain flickered there. Real pain. Not performance. And suddenly I knew something important. Vanessa had been managing him through grief just as carefully as she'd been managing me. Top of form, bottom of form. Daniel stared at the table for a very long time after I asked him that question. Outside, snow continued falling softly across the backyard. The world beyond the windows looked muted and still, while inside my dining room everything felt dangerously close to breaking apart. Finally my son spoke. Dad loved this house, he said quietly. Not enough. Waited. Daniel swallowed hard and rubbed both hands over his face the way Henry used to whenever stress overwhelmed him. He built most of it himself, he added softly. I know that. I nodded. Yes, he did. For one brief moment the room felt different. Less controlled. Less scripted. Real grief had finally entered the conversation, and people like Vanessa struggle when emotions become authentic instead of performative. She recovered quickly. Nobody is denying that, she said gently. But we also have to be practical. Practical. Such a cruel word when spoken too soon after death. Practical meant erase, sell, replace, move on. I turned toward my son. Do you remember the summer your father finished the back deck? I asked quietly. Daniel blinked, surprised. What? You were 14. It was over 90 degrees outside for almost a week. Confusion crossed Vanessa's face immediately. Good. She hated conversations she couldn't control. Daniel looked down slowly, memories returning. He worked nights at the plant and still built during the day, he murmured. I nodded again. He could barely move his shoulders by August. A faint smile almost appeared on Daniel's face. I remember you yelling at him because he refused to hire help. I wasn't yelling, I corrected softly. I was terrified he'd collapse from exhaustion. For the first time in days, silence settled naturally instead of tensely. Then I looked directly at my son. Your father built this house because he wanted family to always have somewhere safe to return to. Daniel's expression changed again. Pain. Shame. Awareness. Not complete awareness yet, but enough. Vanessa noticed immediately. Manipulative people feel emotional shifts the way sailors feel storms approaching. She reached for Daniel's arm again. Nobody wants to take anything away from Eleanor, she said carefully. Take. Interesting choice of word. Because people accidentally reveal truth when pressure cracks their rehearsed language. I leaned back slightly in my chair. Then why was your father measuring Henry's office for renovations? The color drained from Denise's face. Harold stared directly into his coffee. Daniel turned sharply toward Vanessa. You were changing Dad's office too? It was only an idea. 1 week after he died? Vanessa's voice sharpened slightly now. Well, what did you expect us to do? Freeze the entire house forever? There it was. Finally. Not sweet concern. Not gentle support. Frustration. Because grieving people were slowing down her plans. Daniel looked stunned. And suddenly I realized something important. My son truly hadn't understood how far this had already gone. Vanessa had managed him privately, gradually, through selective conversations and emotional pressure. But now the performance was cracking open too quickly. She stood abruptly from the table. I am trying to help everyone here, she snapped. Your mother cannot manage this property alone. I managed it before you arrived, I said calmly. The room went quiet again. Vanessa stared at me. Really stared this time, as though suddenly realizing I wasn't going to collapse emotionally the way she expected. That frightened her, because strong older women create problems for people counting on weakness. Then my phone rang. The sound startled everyone. I glanced down at the screen. Margaret Ellis. Vanessa noticed the name immediately. Her expression changed instantly. Very small. Very fast. But enough. Fear. I answered calmly. Hello, Margaret. Eleanor, the attorney said evenly. I found the updated trust documents your husband filed last year. Across the table, Vanessa stopped breathing for half a second. Interesting. Very interesting. I kept my voice neutral. I see. Margaret continued carefully. There are several things we need to discuss privately. Preferably today. Today. Not eventually. Not next week. Today. A knot formed immediately in Vanessa's jaw. She tried hiding it by reaching for her water glass. Too late. I saw it. Because once manipulation becomes visible, every reaction suddenly means something. Daniel looked confused. What trust documents? I kept my eyes on Vanessa while answering. Apparently your father made legal changes before he died. Silence again. Heavy this time. Harold shifted uncomfortably in his chair. Denise stopped pretending to eat entirely. And Vanessa looked afraid. Not emotional. Not offended. Afraid. Margaret spoke again through the phone. Henry was very specific about protecting your residency rights, Eleanor. Residency rights. The phrase landed in the room like thunder. Daniel frowned immediately. Protecting Mom from what? Nobody answered. Because suddenly everyone understood the same thing at once. Henry had seen this coming before any of us did. And somehow, he had prepared for it. Top of form, nobody spoke after Margaret's call ended. The silence inside the dining room felt alive now. Sharp. Watching. I slowly placed my phone on the table, while snow continued drifting outside the windows in soft white waves. For the first time since Henry's funeral, the balance inside the house had shifted. Not completely, but enough. Daniel looked between me and Vanessa with growing confusion. What does residency rights mean? He asked carefully. Margaret's words still echoed in my mind. Protecting your residency rights. Legal language. Intentional language. Henry had planned something. Vanessa forced a small laugh. I'm sure it's nothing dramatic, she said quickly. Attorneys always use complicated wording. Too quick again. Every time pressure increased, she rushed to shrink the situation before anyone could examine it too closely. I stood slowly from the table. At my age, I said calmly, I've learned that people who insist something is nothing dramatic usually know exactly how dramatic it is. Vanessa's smile disappeared. Daniel noticed. Good. He needed to start noticing. I'm going to meet Margaret this afternoon, I continued. Privately. The word privately landed exactly where I intended it to. Vanessa's shoulders tightened immediately. Why privately? She asked. Because manipulators panic whenever conversations happen outside their control. I buttoned my cardigan carefully before answering. Because my husband trusted her. For one brief second, genuine irritation flashed across Vanessa's face again. Not sadness. Not concern. Irritation. As though Henry continuing to influence this house after death inconvenienced her plans. Daniel stood up suddenly. I'll come with you.
No, Ian suarat gently.
He looked startled. Mom. This conversation is between your father's attorney and me. The room fell quiet again. And suddenly I saw something painful in my son's eyes. Relief. Tiny. Hidden. But there. Part of Daniel wanted someone else to take control because he was exhausted from being caught between guilt and pressure. Weak people often mistake surrender for peace. Vanessa stepped closer to him immediately, placing a hand lightly against his back. Classic. Reclaim physical connection before emotional distance grows. You don't have to do this alone, she told him softly. Interesting. Not. Your mother doesn't have to do this alone. Him. Always him. I watched the two of them carefully then. And for the first time I realized something else. Vanessa wasn't simply trying to control the house. She controlled emotional environments. Conversations. Narratives. Daniel's reactions. Even silence itself. That kind of control doesn't appear overnight. It grows slowly over years. One adjustment at a time. One compromise at a time. One surrendered boundary at a time. By early afternoon, the snow had stopped. I drove myself downtown despite Vanessa insisting the roads were too dangerous for me. Another interesting thing about manipulative people. They always want older women dependent. Dependent people are easier to relocate. Margaret's office sat inside an old red brick building near the courthouse. Henry and I had visited dozens of times over the years for wills, tax paperwork, property records. Walking inside without him beside me nearly broke my heart. Margaret met me personally in the lobby. She was in her early 70s now. Sharp gray bob, navy blazer, intelligent eyes that missed very little. The moment she hugged me, her expression softened. "Oh, Eleanor," she whispered. "I'm so sorry." That nearly shattered me more than anything else had all week. Because unlike everyone at home, Margaret's kindness felt real. No agenda beneath it.
No positioning.
Just grief. Inside her office, she closed the door carefully before sitting across from me at a polished oak conference table. Then she opened a thick file. "Henry updated everything 8 months ago," she said quietly. 8 months. Long before his heart attack. My stomach tightened. He specifically requested protections involving the house. I stared at the paperwork in front of her. What kind of protections? Margaret adjusted her glasses. The property was placed into a protected family trust. I blinked slowly. A trust. She nodded. In simple terms, Eleanor, nobody can force the sale of the home while you're alive and mentally competent. Mentally competent. There was that phrase again. A legal threshold. And suddenly everything Vanessa said over the past week rearranged itself inside my head. Forgetful. Overwhelmed. Lonely. Isolated. Unable to manage alone. She wasn't just pressuring me emotionally. She was building a case. A careful narrative designed to make relocation sound reasonable. Maybe even necessary. Margaret continued speaking. Henry also added something else. She slid another document toward me. "If anyone attempts coercion, manipulation, or pressure involving your residency, they immediately lose future inheritance access connected to the property."
Ich zerrte her.
Then at the paper. Then back again. "He actually wrote that?" Margaret nodded slowly. Word for word. My chest tightened painfully. Because suddenly I could hear Henry's voice in my mind again. "Make sure Eleanor is protected no matter what happens." Tears finally filled my eyes. Not loud tears. Quiet ones. Exhausted ones. Because even near the end of his life, my husband had still been trying to protect me. Margaret lowered her voice carefully. "There's something else you should know." I looked up. She hesitated. "About." For months ago, Vanessa contacted my office privately asking questions about property transfer timelines after widowhood. The room went cold around me. She what? Margaret folded her hands together calmly. She wanted to know how quickly homes typically move through estate transition after a spouse passed away. For months ago, before Henry even died, for several seconds I couldn't breathe properly. Not from shock, from clarity, because suddenly this entire nightmare stopped feeling spontaneous and started feeling planned long before the funeral flowers ever arrived. I sat inside Margaret's office long after she finished speaking. Outside the tall courthouse windows, late afternoon sunlight reflected against dirty snowbanks lining the street. Cars moved slowly through downtown traffic, while my entire understanding of the past few months quietly rearranged itself inside my chest. For months ago, before Henry died, before the funeral, before the casseroles and sympathy cards and forced hugs, Vanessa had already been preparing. Margaret slid a box of tissues gently across the table toward me, but I only folded my hands tighter together. "I keep asking myself the same question," I whispered. Margaret waited patiently. "How did Henry know?" The attorney leaned back slightly in her chair. "I don't think he knew everything," she said carefully, "but I think he noticed enough." Enough. That word hurt, because suddenly memories began returning differently now. Small moments I dismissed at the time. Vanessa asking oddly specific questions about property taxes during Thanksgiving dinner last year. The way Henry once became unusually quiet after overhearing her complain that the house was wasted on 2 old people. The afternoon I walked into the kitchen unexpectedly and found Henry staring silently while Vanessa described modern open-concept renovations. At the time, none of it seemed important. Now every memory carried shadows underneath it. Margaret opened another folder. "There's one more thing Henry instructed me to do if you ever felt pressured inside the home." My heartbeat slowed. She handed me a document. Temporary removal authorization. I frowned slightly. What is this? If necessary, Margaret explained calmly, you have the legal authority to remove anyone residing in the property who creates emotional distress, coercion, or hostile living conditions. Remove. The word felt almost unreal, because for the past week, I had felt powerless inside my own home. Small. Outnumbered. Managed. And suddenly Henry's final act as my husband reached across death itself to place strength back into my hands. Margaret looked directly at me. You are not trapped, Eleanor. That sentence nearly broke me. Not trapped. I didn't realize until that moment how trapped I'd already begun feeling. I lowered my eyes to the paperwork again. What happens if I use this? Margaret's expression remained calm. They leave. Simple. Clean. Final. I thought about Vanessa reorganizing my kitchen, her father measuring Henry's office, the retirement brochures, the real estate estimates hidden beside the trash can, and worse than all of that, I thought about my son sitting silently through it, not protecting me, not stopping it, just allowing it to happen because conflict exhausted him more than injustice did. Margaret softened her voice. You don't need to decide today. But I already had. Because grief changes shape eventually. First it crushes you. Then one day, beneath all the sadness, something harder begins forming. Self-preservation. By the time I drove home, dusk had settled across the neighborhood. Warm yellow lights glowed through nearby windows while Christmas decorations had already started appearing on porches up and down the street. Ordinary life continuing. It almost offended me. How dare the world keep moving after Henry disappeared from it? I parked slowly in the driveway and froze. A contractor van sat outside my garage. My stomach tightened instantly. The moment I stepped inside the house, I heard voices in the living room. Male voices. Vanessa looked up brightly when I entered. There you are, she said cheerfully. We didn't expect you back so soon. We. Always we. A tall man stood beside paint catalogs spread across my coffee table. My coffee table. The one Henry bought during our 25th anniversary trip to Chicago. This is Rick, Vanessa explained smoothly. He's just giving us ideas for opening the downstairs space. Opening the downstairs space. As though renovation had already been approved. Rick extended his hand awkwardly. I ignored it. Instead, I looked directly at Vanessa. You brought contractors into my house? Her smile flickered slightly. We're only exploring options. Options. That word again. Everything was always an option until suddenly it became reality. Daniel appeared from the hallway looking nervous immediately. Mom, it's not what you think. Interesting. Because guilty people always know exactly what you think. I slowly removed my gloves, then set my purse carefully on the entry table. The entire room had gone tense now. Good. Let them feel tense. For one full week, I had swallowed every discomfort quietly while strangers discussed my future around me like I was already disappearing. No more. I turned toward the contractor. You should leave. The man blinked awkwardly. Vanessa stood immediately. Eleanor, you're overreacting. No, I said calmly. I'm finally reacting correctly. That shut the room silent. Even Daniel stared at me differently. Because this was the first time since Henry's death that I sounded like myself again. Rick gathered his folders quickly. I think maybe I should go. Yes, I answered. You should. The front door closed behind him moments later. Then it was just family. Or whatever remained of it. Vanessa crossed her arms tightly. You're making this situation much harder than it needs to be. I looked directly at her. No. You did that when you started planning renovations before my husband was buried. Color drained from Daniel's face. What renovations? He asked quietly. I reached calmly into my purse, then placed Margaret's documents onto the coffee table between us. Vanessa saw the attorney letterhead instantly, and for the first time since this nightmare began, she looked genuinely afraid. Nobody moved after I placed the documents on the coffee table. The living room felt frozen in place. Outside, evening snow reflected pale blue light through the windows while the Christmas lights across the street blinked quietly in the darkness. Somewhere nearby, a dog barked once and then everything fell silent again. Vanessa stared at the attorney letterhead like it might explode. Daniel picked up the top page slowly. What is this? he asked. I removed my coat carefully before answering. Your father's final protections. The room changed immediately. Not emotionally. Structurally. Because suddenly this was no longer a discussion about grief or what's best for Eleanor. Now it was legal.
Permanent.
Real. Daniel scanned the first page while confusion slowly gave way to disbelief. He put the house into a trust? Yes. His eyes moved faster across the document, then stopped. No one can force sale or transfer of the property while mom remains mentally competent. He read quietly. Silence. Heavy silence. Then his face changed completely. What the hell is this part? He whispered. I already knew which section he'd reached. The inheritance clause. Vanessa stepped forward too quickly. Daniel, let me see that. He pulled the paper away instinctively. No, for the first time. In weeks my son sounded firm. Actually firm. Vanessa froze. Tiny moment. But important. Because controlling people panic when influence slips unexpectedly. Daniel kept reading. Any individual attempting coercion, manipulation, or pressure regarding Eleanor Whitmore's residency rights forfeits all future inheritance claims connected to the property. The words settled into the room like stones dropping through water. Harold sat down heavily in the recliner. Denise went pale. And Vanessa looked furious. Not sad. Not hurt. Furious. Because Henry had outmaneuvered her before she even started playing the game. That's ridiculous, she snapped suddenly. This makes it sound like we're criminals. Nobody answered. Because deep down, everyone in the room knew exactly why Henry wrote it. Daniel looked up slowly. You contacted a realtor before Dad even died? Vanessa blinked rapidly. It wasn't like that. Margaret told Mom you asked about property transfer timelines 4 months ago. The room exploded into silence again. This time uglier. Vanessa turned toward me sharply. You went digging through private conversations?
No, Ian Suarat calmly.
I finally started listening. Daniel stood up so quickly the coffee table rattled. 4 months ago, he repeated. Dad was still alive. Vanessa's composure cracked completely then. I was trying to plan ahead, she shouted. Someone in this family had to. There it is, I said quietly. Everyone looked at me. I folded my hands together calmly. The truth. Vanessa laughed bitterly. Oh please. You want the truth?
Fine.
She pointed around the house angrily. This place is too big, too expensive, and completely unrealistic for one old woman. Old woman. Not Eleanor. Not Mom. Just old woman. Daniel stared at his wife like he no longer recognized her. But Vanessa couldn't stop now. People reveal themselves fully once the mask finally slips. You sit in dark rooms talking to dead people while the entire house falls apart around you, she continued harshly. Somebody had to make practical decisions. Practical. Again. Always practical when cruelty wanted to sound intelligent. I looked at my son quietly. And suddenly I saw it happen. The exact moment denial left his face. Because hearing manipulation privately is one thing. Watching it openly is another. You moved your parents in 3 days after Dad died, Daniel said slowly. Vanessa crossed her arms defensively. You were grieving. You couldn't handle things. No, he whispered. You didn't even give Mom time to breathe. That sentence nearly shattered me. Not because it fixed anything, but because finally my son saw it. Vanessa looked around the room desperately now. At her parents. At Daniel. At me. The control she spent years building was collapsing too fast. Then she made her final mistake. If your father cared so much, she snapped toward me, maybe he should have left the house directly to you instead of cleaning up your messes from the grave. Daniel flinched like she slapped him. The room went completely still. Because even cruel people usually know when they've crossed a line too far. I stood slowly. At 68, grief still lived in my bones. My hands still ached in cold weather. I still reached for Henry at night sometimes before remembering he was gone. But weakness and grief are not the same thing. I looked directly at Vanessa. You should pack your things. Her eyes widened. What? Yours. Your parents. All of it. Daniel stared at me. I kept my voice calm. Margaret already prepared removal authorization documents. Vanessa laughed nervously. You can't be serious. I am. You'd throw family out during the holidays? I almost smiled then, because suddenly she cared about cruelty.
No, iyan suarat sufli.
You ended this family the moment you treated my grief like an opportunity. Silence. Then Daniel lowered his head into his hands. And quietly, he started crying. Not loudly. Not dramatically. Just exhausted. Ashamed tears from a man finally realizing how much damage happened while he stayed silent. An hour later, suitcases rolled across my hardwood floors again. But this time they were leaving. Harold avoided looking at me completely. Denise muttered angry little comments under her breath while stuffing coats into bags. Vanessa said nothing at all. That told me everything. Because manipulative people become quiet once consequences finally arrive. At the front door, Daniel stopped beside me. Snow drifted softly behind him in the darkness. I'm sorry, Mom, he whispered brokenly. I looked at my son for a long time, then nodded once. I know. Not forgiveness. Not yet. Just truth. After the cars disappeared down the street, the house became still again. Real stillness. I locked the front door myself. Then I walked slowly through every room. The kitchen. The hallway. Henry's office. Our bedroom. Home. Still ours. Upstairs, I opened the closet and rested my forehead briefly against one of Henry's jackets. I handled it. I whispered. And somehow, for the first time since the funeral, the house no longer felt hollow. It felt protected. Bottom of form, bottom of form.